The night was heavy in Arkansas, the kind that pressed down on a child's chest and made the air feel too thick to breathe. A boy no older than 13 stumbled out of a small wooden house, his bare feet scraping against gravel, his clothes torn at the seams, his skin marked with dirt. His name was Eliot, and he had just been pushed out into the world by the only people he thought he could rely on, his foster parents. They had found out the truth about him, a truth he could not change. Eliot liked boys, and for that alone, they decided he was no longer worth keeping. The screen door slammed behind him, the sound sharp like a final sentence. Eliot's hands trembled as he clutched the thin fabric of his shirt. Every fiber of him wanted to beg for one more chance, but the words had already been spoken. "You don't belong here. Get out." The rejection cut deeper than the cold night air. He was not just unwanted, he was disposable. He wandered aimlessly down the silent street, the glow of the porch light fading behind him. Each step carried the weight of despair, yet he kept moving, as if his small body knew that stopping meant breaking apart completely. The town slept, blind to the boy thrown away like a broken toy. And then, as he rounded a corner, two figures in uniform came into view, police officers standing by their patrol car, speaking quietly under the dim orange glow of a street lamp. Eliot hesitated, his heart pounding, fear colliding with desperate need. He dragged his bruised feet forward, his thin frame barely visible in the shadows. When the officers noticed him, they froze. It wasn't his ragged clothes or the scratches on his legs that struck them. It was his eyes. They did not look like a child's eyes. They looked far older, worn by secrets and pain no 13-year-old should carry. He stopped just short of them, his voice trembling but steady enough to pierce the silence. "Please help me. They threw me out. Just because I'm gay." The younger officer instinctively bent down, his expression softening, while the older one glanced at the boy's state with a mixture of concern and unease. Eliot's words hovered in the air, heavy and undeniable. This was not the story of a runaway or a child who misbehaved. This was the story of a boy cast aside for who he was, forced to beg strangers for the safety his own home had denied him. The officers exchanged a silent look, a mixture of disbelief and quiet anger at the cruelty of it all. One opened the back door of the patrol car, gesturing gently. Eliot climbed in without resistance, his small body sinking into the cold leather seat. No tears fell, no wailing for mercy. He sat still, as though he had already used up all the grief he had to give. As the car pulled away, the street grew silent once again, leaving only the echo of Eliot's words in the night. A truth so simple, yet so devastating, a child discarded for daring to exist as himself. And no one watching that moment could guess what lay ahead, that this same boy, stripped of family and safety, would soon unlock a truth buried for years. Because sometimes, the ones pushed into the shadows carry the light strong enough to expose what others have tried so hard to keep hidden. Eliot closed his eyes as the car rolled on, unaware that his story was only beginning. If you are listening now, remember, this family is not defined by the walls that shelter you, but by the arms that refuse to let you go. And if this story moves you, subscribe to Heart Stories, where voices like Eliot's are never forgotten, and where stories of truth and resilience find their home. Inside the patrol car, the hum of the engine filled the silence. Eliot leaned his head against the window, watching streetlights blur into streaks of orange and white. He did not cry. His eyes stayed dry, fixed on something beyond the glass, as though his heart had gone too numb to weep anymore. The officers exchanged glances in the front seat, unsettled by how still he sat. Children abandoned at night usually trembled with fear or clung desperately to anyone who showed kindness. But Eliot seemed distant, as if he had already lived through more nights like this than any child should. Then, in a voice so faint it was nearly swallowed by the tires against the asphalt, Eliot whispered a memory. It was not about the house he had just been forced out of. It was about another house, one painted a soft yellow, with flowers climbing up the windows and the smell of fresh cookies drifting through every room. He remembered a woman with silver threads in her hair, her hands always dusted with flour. her laugh warm enough to make the Kados retreat. She called him Pumpkin. Every time the word left her lips, he felt safe, as though the world itself had chosen to keep him. The officers paused, their attention sharpening. This was not the memory of a boy describing his current home. It was something older, something buried. The younger officer glanced back, asking carefully about the woman, but Eliot only pressed his forehead harder against the glass, refusing to look at them. He spoke as if repeating a dream too fragile to disturb. He described a lullaby hummed softly in the dark, a chair that rocked gently by the window, a blanket stitched with clumsy hands but wrapped around him with pride. Then, almost like a confession, he said he didn't know if it was real or something his mind had invented to survive the blows, the insults, and the loneliness that had followed. The older officer shifted uncomfortably, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. There was something about the details that didn't feel imagined. The boy's voice trembled with the certainty of someone recalling, not inventing. And yet, if Eliot had lived with this memory, why had his foster parents never mentioned it? Why had he ended up in a house where he was treated like a burden rather than a child? A question began to grow in the silence between them. Could it be that Eliot had not truly belonged to the family that cast him out? Could it be that somewhere long before the rejection, he had once been loved deeply, fiercely, and then torn away from it? Eliot closed his eyes, clutching his knees against his chest. The car rocked gently as it turned onto another road, but his mind stayed fixed on the house with the yellow walls. He could almost smell the cookies again, almost hear the soft hum of a lullaby promising him he was wanted. He didn't tell the officers that those memories had carried him through the worst nights, the nights when words like freak and worthless rang louder than any comfort. Those memories, whether real or imagined, were proof to him that love was not a fantasy. And as the car sped forward, those fragments of the past began to spark suspicion in the officers' minds. A story was unraveling, one that Eliot himself did not fully understand. Perhaps the boy cast aside tonight had once been at the center of something precious, something taken from him long ago. In that silence, one truth lingered. When love is denied, memory becomes a lifeline. A child will cling to the smallest traces of warmth, building a shelter in his mind against the coldness of the world. For Eliot, the image of a house painted yellow and a woman's voice calling him Pumpkin was not just nostalgia, it was survival. And for anyone listening, there lies a lesson: what we give to children, in kindness or cruelty, is never forgotten. A single moment of love can carry them through years of darkness, just as a single act of rejection can scar them beyond words. Eliot had been left with both, and now his past was about to demand answers. The next days unfolded like a slow unwrapping of a wound no one wanted to touch. The officers who had found Eliot could not let go of the boy's strange memories. A yellow house, the scent of cookies, the name Pumpkin. These fragments did not sound like the imagination of a neglected child. They sounded like echoes from another life, one that had been torn away from him. Official channels were opened, paperwork, old reports, and dusty records that had been left to fade in filing cabinets were pulled back into the light. What began as a simple welfare check became something larger. And there, buried in police archives from nearly a decade earlier, a case emerged. A report filed by a woman named Margaret Holloway. She had told authorities that the little boy she had raised disappeared one night without a trace. A foster mother, grieving and desperate. Her pleas had gone unanswered as days turned into weeks and hope dissolved into silence. The file included photographs. One showed a woman with hair touched by silver, her eyes kind, her smile deepened by years of laughter and labor. She held a toddler in her arms, a boy wrapped in a handmade quilt. When the picture was placed before Eliot, he did not hesitate. His breath caught, his voice cracked, and he whispered the word that had lived in him all these years, Nana. The officers exchanged a glance, but something undeniable had surfaced. This was no dream invented to cope with cruelty. These were real fragments of a childhood stolen from him. The The question now was how a boy who had once lived in warmth and tenderness had ended up in the hands of people who saw him only as an inconvenience. The deeper the search went, the uglier the truth became. Financial records revealed transfers of money, small but regular, to the couple who had raised Eliot. On paper, it was labeled as support, but there was nothing of support in the way they treated him. It looked less like care and more like a transaction, an arrangement that reduced a child's life into dollars. For Eliot, hearing these pieces was disorienting. He had grown used to believing the harsh words of his foster parents, that he was a burden, an unwanted mistake. Now, to learn that once he had been loved and then passed around like property, left him numb. The boy who never cried now stared at the wall, his jaw tight, as if clinging to silence was the only way to stop himself from shattering. Meanwhile, for the officers, a new responsibility formed. This was not simply about placing a child into temporary shelter. This was about justice. A boy had been taken from a safe home, handed to strangers, and left to suffer for nearly a decade. Someone had chosen to ignore his cries, and someone had profited from his pain. When Margaret Holloway was contacted, her voice broke through the phone with disbelief and trembling hope. She had never stopped wondering what happened to her little pumpkin. Year after year, she had left the porch light on, as if one day it might guide him back. Now, the past she thought buried under grief was stirring again. For Eliot, the evidence reshaped everything. His memories were not illusions. The smell of cookies, the warmth of arms rocking him to sleep. The word pumpkin, whispered in the dark, those were real, and they had been stolen, ripped away in the night, replaced with coldness, insults, and the sharp sting of rejection. The truth illuminated a cruel paradox. A child can lose years of love, but the body remembers, the heart remembers. What society often overlooks is that the scars of neglect are not only bruises on skin, they are fractures in trust, in identity, in the belief that one deserves to be cherished. As the investigation widened, one lesson became clear. Systems meant to protect children can sometimes fail them, leaving the vulnerable trapped in silence. And yet, buried in that silence, memory can hold a lifeline back to truth. Eliot's memories, fragile as they seemed, became the key to unlocking the injustice he had endured. And so the secret of his stolen past was no longer hidden. It was written in faded photographs, in forgotten files, and most of all, in the unwavering memory of a boy who never stopped carrying the warmth of a grandmother's arms inside him. The moment Eliot was brought to meet Margaret Holloway, time itself seemed to falter. She stood in the doorway of her small yellow house, her body fragile with age, but her eyes alive with hope. The years had etched lines across her face, yet the instant she saw the boy step forward, recognition overcame hesitation. Her hands shook as she reached out, her voice breaking into a cry that seemed torn from a decade of waiting. "Pumpkin," she whispered, before pulling him into her arms. Eliot stiffened at first, uncertain whether this embrace was safe. But as the smell of flower and lavender clung to him, something inside cracked open. He allowed himself to be held, to collapse into her chest, and in that surrender came a sob he had held back for years. The woman wept as though she could wash away all the pain with her tears. "I searched for you. I never stopped searching," she said, her words trembling against his hair. 9 years. Pumpkin. 9 long years. For Eliot, the reunion was almost unbearable. The warmth felt foreign after so much rejection. His mind struggled to believe that the lullabies and the cookies and the tender name were not just illusions, but real, alive. And standing before him, he wanted to stay in her arms forever, to erase the empty years that had scarred him. Yet reality did not give him peace for long. The sound of tires screeched against the pavement. A car door slammed. From the shadows emerged the very people who had thrown him out just nights earlier, his foster parents. Their faces twisted not with guilt, but with fury. Fear of exposure burned in their eyes. They shouted his name as if possession were a matter of volume, demanding that he return, claiming authority they had forfeited long ago. The scene turned chaotic. Margaret clung to Eliot, her frail frame shielding him with a strength that came not from her body, but from love. The foster parents advanced, their voices sharp, insisting on their rights, insisting on their role as guardians. Their words were laced not with care, but with desperation, a fear that the truth of their arrangement, the money, the neglect, the years of cruelty would soon unravel for all to see. Eliot froze between them, his small body trembling, torn between fear of those who had controlled his life and the fragile safety now wrapped around him. The officers, already anticipating this eruption, stepped forward. One stood firmly between the foster parents and the boy, raising a hand to halt their advance. The other escorted Margaret and Eliot inside, their presence a barrier against the chaos outside. The shouting continued, accusations hurled like stones, demands to retain custody, claims of ownership over a child they had failed to love. For Eliot, it was like standing at the crossroads of his life. On one side was the cruelty he had endured. On the other was the fragile possibility of healing. His heart pounded with the terror that somehow the past might tighten its grip again. But Margaret's grip never wavered. Her arms stayed around him, her tears wet against his hair. "You are safe now," she whispered, her voice trembling yet fierce. "No one will take you from me again." For the first time in years, Eliot allowed himself to believe those words might be true. The police finally ended the standoff, ordering the foster parents away while paperwork in courts would decide the final outcome. The couple's anger echoed down the street, but it no longer mattered. Eliot was no longer their secret to hide or their burden to discard. He had been found, reclaimed by the love that had once been his and could be again. In the quiet that followed, Eliot sat with Margaret in her living room. The yellow walls seemed to glow in the evening light, and for a moment he let himself breathe. The weight on his chest loosened, just enough to imagine that maybe home was possible. The lesson lingered in that fragile calm: love does not erase the wounds of cruelty, but it gives them space to heal. And sometimes confronting the past is the only way to step into a future where dignity and belonging are no longer denied. The courtroom was hushed, the kind of silence that clings to the walls before truth is spoken. Eliot sat at the front, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his small frame dwarfed by the high-backed wooden chair. Beside him, Margaret Holloway sat close, her presence steady, though her own hands trembled with the weight of what this moment meant. Across the aisle sat the foster parents, their faces hard and unyielding, as if daring the world to believe they still had a right to call him theirs. The judge's voice cut through the stillness, asking for testimony. Eliot's breath quivered, but when he stood, his eyes no longer darted toward the floor. He faced the room, Disha, his voice fragile yet unbreakable. "I don't need money," he said softly, but every word reached the corners of the chamber. "I don't need new clothes, or toys, or anything like that. I just need a place to call home, a place where I can be myself." The words hung heavy in the air. The gallery behind him shifted, people whispering to one another, but no one missed the clarity of his plea. A child was not asking for luxuries. He was asking for dignity, for the simple right to belong without fear of being thrown away again. The judge's expression softened, the gavel resting motionless in his hand. Margaret's testimony followed, her voice breaking as she described the night Eliot had vanished, the endless search, the prayers whispered into the dark when hope felt impossible. Every sentence carried the weight of years stolen. She turned toward Eliot, her tears shining in the sterile courtroom light. "He is my pumpkin," she said. "I do not care what blood says. He has always been mine in love." The foster parents attempted to argue, but their words rang hollow. They spoke of guardianship, of responsibility, but their tone carried no tenderness. Records of neglect and the suspicious payments weighed heavily against them. The truth of their motives had already been revealed, and no speech could rewrite it. At last, the judge lowered his eyes, then raised them to meet Eliot's. The ruling came with a quiet gravity that silenced every murmur in the room. Custody was awarded to Margaret Holloway. Eliot's shoulders shook as relief flooded through him. Margaret pressed her hands to her face, weeping openly, her tears the long-awaited end of a nightmare. Yet the final twist came when the old case file was revisited. In faded ink, the first notes revealed that Eliot was never related to Margaret by blood. He had been found abandoned as a newborn, left on her doorstep swaddled in a blanket. Margaret had chosen him that day, not because of heritage, but because love compelled her to keep him. The revelation rippled through the courtroom, but Margaret only smiled through her tears, drawing Eliot closer. "Blood doesn't make a family," she whispered. "Love does." Later, back at the yellow house, Eliot stood by the window, the same place where he once watched the world with longing. In his hand, he held a small rainbow flag, its colors vivid in the soft afternoon light. With careful hands, he placed it against the glass, letting it face the world beyond. His reflection in the pane showed a boy still healing, but no longer broken. He whispered, almost to himself, "At last I have a home." And in that moment, the story of a boy, abandoned for who he was, became something larger. A reminder that identity is never a reason to be discarded, and that the truest families are the ones who choose to love without conditions. Now I ask you, if you were in Eliot's place, what would home mean to you, or your thoughts below? And if this story touched you, subscribe to Heart Stories, because here every voice matters, every story of resilience is honored, and no child, no matter who they are, should ever feel alone again.